Who's telling your story? Now, this is a very, very important question that I would say most people would answer or would like to answer the same way. So, me asking you the question, who's telling your story, right? Most people are going to say, "Oh, I'm telling my story." But then you begin to evaluate people's lives, the decisions they make and why they make the decisions that they make, right? You begin to be seeing it from the observer's eye as opposed to hearing somebody say it from their own mouth, right? And you begin to realize very, very quickly that most people are not telling their story. Their story is somewhat being told, but they're not the one that's telling it. Their life is being lived, but they're barely the one that's living it. And I find that to be very, very interesting. So, like I said, when I ask you the question, be honest with yourself. Who's telling your story? What is the realistic guiding force that dictates your story? Is it actually you, or is it the circumstances that you're in? Is it actually you, or is it the excuses that you tell yourself that guide you truly? Is it you yourself, or is it the emotions that you have that dictate whether you get work done or whether you don't get work done? Whether you improve yourself or whether you don't improve yourself? Is it the "oh, I'll do it later" or "oh, I'll do it tomorrow"? Is it that mindset? Are you leading with that? Is that telling your story? Begin to ask yourself all these questions because these questions are very, very important and must be answered. And like I said, you must be real with yourself. Because like I said, most people would like to give themselves the illusion of, you know what, I'm in charge. I'm in control. And like I said, realistically for the most part, that's not true. And it's never been true. So, who's telling your story? For me personally, I'd say this for the longest time. For the longest time, even when I was already deep into my self-development journey, who was telling my story? I would say my environment. My curated environment was telling my story. And when I say curated environment, it was the friends that I selected, the actions that I was um the actions that my environment suggested that were good to do. That dictated a lot of was telling my story. Also, like I said, my curated environment online as well. Everybody has their own curated environment. If you don't know what that is, essentially it's all the things that you select to go ahead and choose to consume, right? All the things that you want to go ahead and watch. That is essentially going to be most people's guiding force of who's telling your story, right? So, with that being said, there's a great argument to be made that most people are not telling their story. So you must ask yourself, why is that? What are the limiting factors and the difference between somebody who's telling their story and somebody who's truly not, who's letting outside things dictate who's actually telling that story, right? So obviously, if you've seen the theme in these last, let's just say, like 10 episodes, right? It's been a very, very similar theme, but I'm gonna go ahead and do another twist for this one specifically. But I think it's very interesting, and I need people to truly open their eyes to see how much control is being had over your life and the decisions that you make, even the free will that you think you have. You might not have it as much as you would like to think, and that is the harshest reality that I came to as of recently when it comes to people and how they operate within their own life. I think that's very, very interesting. So so like I said, let's be honest. Is it your environment or is it you that's dictating who tells your story, right? And the only way that you really can reclaim control over who tells your story is if you decide to make decisions for yourself that regardless of how you feel, that you know is best for you in your life and the future you that does it should exist, right? You must make decisions based off of that because if you choose not to, we all know who's telling your story. You see what I'm saying? The only way that you're actually telling your story is if you're a conscious storyteller. If you're constantly applying new things, evaluating things to see if they work, taking out the things that don't and implementing more things that do. That is you telling your story. So like when I was saying earlier, Who's telling your story? Is it your environment? Is it the circumstances that you're in? Is it the excuses that you tell yourself? Of course, those all somewhat play a role within what is actually telling your story, right? But with that being said, that's why I mentioned. I see time and time again, most people are not telling their story. So who's telling your story? Answer those questions for yourself. And like I mentioned, for me, for the longest time, it wasn't exactly me. It was me to an extent, but it wasn't being told from my future self. Does that make sense? You want your future self to tell a story about your current situation that is favorable to your future self and your future self. Think about that for a second. Think about that for a second. And if you choose to defy that, who's telling your story then? To an extent, when I'm saying this, you yourself right now shouldn't be telling your story. Think about that for a second. You yourself right now, and it kind of goes into this scenario. I'm sure you've heard this before. What you want and what you want to want. That's all. I'll break that down for you, for the people that don't understand this paradigm before. There are certain things that you want, right? So I want to eat unhealthy. Most people want to eat unhealthy, right? But what you want to want is to eat better because you know your future self will thank you. And you also know if you just eat what you want right now, your future self is going to be kicking you in the ass, saying my past self made a mistake, right? So it's almost that same thing. So who's telling your story? Is it what you want right now? Is it this present moment that is telling you this story? Or is it your future self that is telling the story? Ask that question for yourself. For me personally, I would like to think, and of course everybody would say they would like to think this as well, right? But like I said, you must evaluate the actions of that person. I would like to think my future self is telling the story of the present moment right now. And it is because based off of my actions, based off of my habits, based off of the things that I choose to do that are great long term investments, that maybe I don't see as much benefit in the current moment, but a year goes by, 2 years goes by, and now I see the rewards that will be reaped from the trees that I planted 2 or 3 years ago, right? Or maybe even 6 years ago when I started my self development journey, right? But that should be the one that tells the story, not what you want right now, not who you are right now. That person should not be telling the story. Because, like I had mentioned, if this person was telling the story, if the present moment person was telling the story, would they even be telling a good story at all? And that's most important. So begin to evaluate that for yourself. If you yourself right now is telling the story of your life right now and of your future, is that a story that you even want to hear? Is that even a story worth hearing? Think about that for example. Think about that. Think about that. What you want truly, not want to want, not all that, not all that. What you want, what most people want, is for them to be in a position where their future self, which is like I said, which would be your present self, right, is essentially reflecting back storytelling, right, about the present self right now, right. I know hopefully you don't get too lost, right, but they're talking about them in a favorable way, right. So the only way that your future self could talk about your present self in a favorable way is if you're taking the actions today that would reap you the benefits of the future. You're doing it and you're investing in your future self. You're not investing in your present self because, like I mentioned, right? If I wanted to invest in my present self, most people, just like I would probably not invest too wisely. Let's just say that. And that is the case for most people. Most people are investing for themselves right now. They make decisions for how they feel right now. They make decisions that don't dictate a great future. And then they're mad why they're in a future position. I thought things were going to change. I hoped for things to go ahead and change. I prayed for things to go ahead and change. But your present self didn't change. So why the hell would your future self change? It wouldn't make any sense. It wouldn't make any sense. But yet you see so many people whose lives are not getting told by themselves. Think about that. Like I had mentioned, who's telling your story? Is it actually you, or is it the excuses that you tell yourself? Is it that limiting voice within your head that is telling the story? Is it your environment that is putting you down, that is telling your story? And are you just accepting of that? Because if you're not accepting of that, if you are not satisfied with your current situation right now, you're the only person that can change that. So therefore, what are the actions that would suggest a change that you'd want? And then when you begin to ask yourself that question, you must understand that most people still, even with me saying that, still not going to do anything with that. That's the craziest part about it. And like I had mentioned, and then they wonder why the hell the story of their life isn't a great story to tell that no one wants to hear. It is because you didn't even want to hear that story, because your present self is making the decisions. Like I had mentioned, who's telling your story? And like I said, your present self, when I'm mentioning your present self telling the story, your present self is going to be comprised of all the things that you choose to go ahead and do. Like I said, maybe it's your environment that influences you to do certain things, right? Take certain actions, build certain habits, create certain friends, go out certain places, right? Have new experiences, for the better or for the worse, right? These things are essentially going to dictate your your present moment, right? But with all this being said, who's telling your story? Is it you? Is it you of the future that's telling a great story? Or is it you of the future that is telling the same story that they're living in right now? You see what I'm saying? Like I said, hopefully you can keep up with what I'm trying to say, but there's just too much of a strong argument to be had when it comes to the perception that you could have of most people and their life and the story that they've told. That has been told, essentially, which is their existence, right? Most of them, they don't have a good story to tell, so no one hears it. No one cares to listen. That's just what it is. That's just being real with it, right? So, like I had mentioned, what are the limiting factors that are limiting you from telling a great story in the future? Those things are the poor decisions that most people make on a day to day basis. They cannot see anything past the current moment. It's almost as if they don't think the future will happen. And then 5 years goes by, and they say, where did the time go? What was I doing within that time? Why am I not where I want to be? Why am I not who I want to be? And it's because of your poor decision making. It's always going to end like that. It's always going to end with your present moment. What are the decisions that you're making in the present moment? Are they good enough for your future self? Are they good enough to be told later in a story that hopefully is a great one? Or are they not? That's just what it is, man. Begin to ask yourself these questions because these questions will dictate your life, whether you would like to admit it or not, whether you want to hear that or not, whether you believe in me or whether you don't believe in me or not. It's that, like I said, I didn't make it this way. This is nothing more than I'm nothing more than an observer just like you when it comes to these things. But like I had mentioned, right? Evaluate the people around you. Who's telling their story truly? Who's telling their story? For the most part, it's not them. It's not who they want to be telling the story.